Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com. Some of you have asked me to act as a bit of a raconteur and talk a little bit about my history as a performing artist. And I use the term artist very, very loosely. But I thought I would do a little chat about my love of the tam-tam and what it has done for me and what it can do for you, potentially. You see, one of the things that happens in the world is that if you're a percussionist, community orchestras, school orchestras need percussion instruments. They desperately need them, especially if they're amateur groups. I mean, if you're at a music school, obviously they have tons and tons of instruments all sitting around. But as often as not, if you are out there in the world full of music lovers wanting to get together and make music and play some really fine music, they're missing some basic implements in the percussion section. And at some point, there comes a time when the rest of the orchestra wants to do something more than watch the strings play concerti grossi or Mozart's symphonies, Handel concerti grossi just for strings. Everybody wants something good to do, but usually if you have something that's really cool for the brass, you're going to need some percussion, and the percussion is going to need their equipment. And it's not like, even though you may have seen like these string players with giant double bass cases and tubas and things, schlepping along on city buses or airplanes or whatnot, a bass drum is kind of hard to move around. It has to be played in situ, as they say. Wherever you're going, they better have one. And not only that, you don't have regular rehearsal spaces. You rehearse wherever they'll let you rehearse, basically. And that could be an issue. So I started playing percussion when I was at Johns Hopkins University as an undergraduate. And I was desperate to play in the orchestra because I just loved orchestral music. I'd been collecting records since I was like 6. And so, I knew the repertoire, the basic repertoire, backwards and forwards, but I was desperate to play it, and I was such a crappy performer. Oh, God, I was terrible. I had taken piano lessons on and off for years, and I was studying clarinet when I was in grammar school, and every time I practiced, our dog tried to chew her way through my bedroom door to get at me, make it stop. And then I was doing it again when I was in college. And at one point I attempted to play the viola, which was really kind of a mistake because, unless you start when you're young, your hand never becomes flexible enough to get around the neck of the instrument. I thought it would be easier than a violin because it's bigger, and it was. But making a nice sound out of it wasn't any easier. I was just a major disappointment to myself as a performing artist, and I wanted to do something. So I thought, utility percussion. That's what we're called when we're not timpanists. We are utility percussion. That means we play all the other stuff. And particularly in community orchestras, you're not going to do sophisticated modern works with, crazy mallet parts that require, hold mallets at each crook of each finger and whack up, 7-note chords on a marimba. It wasn't stuff like that. It's stuff like, the triangle part in Brahms' Fourth Symphony, or the cymbal part in Tchaikovsky's Fourth and the finale, things like that. Rossini overtures where you're just going bangity, 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 bang, that kind of stuff. That I could do. And I already knew the music. I didn't even have to read the part. I just knew when to come in, although I did actually count. I will tell you, I did count. So, I'd started at the Johns Hopkins Symphony, but then I moved to California to go to graduate school at Stanford University. And I was playing in the Stanford Symphony, where they had a very ample music department with all of the necessary percussion equipment. But doing 1 or 2 concerts a year was no fun. I wanted to be out there in the community. And the Peninsula has many community orchestras that were run by enterprising young music people and conductors, some of whom had talent and some of whom didn't, but I didn't care. I just wanted to play. But how do you get into these orchestras? What do you do? Well, what I discovered was that the answer is simply to own your own percussion section, because they're all desperate. They need you. And if they need you, then they will let you come and basically do whatever you want because you have the instruments. And I thought to myself, what instrument can I get that I can actually carry around? I mean, a set of cymbals was no problem, but everybody has those. A triangle, unbelievably portable, perfectly portable. Snare drum, that required much more technique than I would ever probably acquire, although I did get some. Same thing with timpani. I mean, I could get some, but timpani, they would find a timpanist who would do this stuff. Nope, utility percussion was the thing. And the one instrument that I could have, that no one else had, that I could drag around the peninsula was a tam-tam. But where to get a tam-tam? So I went zipping around music stores on the peninsula, and I'm something that I could afford. I was a student. I had nothing. I found in a music shop for about $50 something similar to this guy. This is why I have this here, by the way. This is sort of your average 20-some-odd inch gong, they called it. It's a tam-tam. This one's made by Paista. Now, in those days, this was in the early 80s, you know, the Paista, it was a fabulous manufacturer of cymbals. Paista and Sabian. Right? No, this is Sabian. Pardon me. That wasn't Paista. This is Sabian. But Paista made gongs. I'm sorry about that. You know who I'm talking about. The cymbal people. Sabian made cymbals, principally for pop music, rock cymbals, you know, for rock and roll musicians. Paista does make tam-tams, fabulous tam-tams. So that's a different thing. But Sabian made cymbals. And Zildjian was the great competitor. They're the same family. They had a fight. They set up separate stores, all in Massachusetts, by the way, at least originally. One was in Sabian, I think, moved to Canada. But they were in Massachusetts. They were originally Turkish, but they're made in the U.S. And so Zildjian and Sabian were the cymbal manufacturers, and they also made gongs kind of on the side. Now what they do is import them from China, the good ones. But back then they made their own, and they weren't so hot. They've become much better because the competition has become a lot stiffer, and people no longer have any problem getting good instruments from China. So now they make good ones. This is a pretty good one. Anyway, but I saw this Sabian gong, and it was about this size, and it was owned by some sort of old sort of like mariachi wedding ensemble called Los Banditos. And I know that because they had painted Los Banditos right across the front of the gong, which they had also glued feathers and other, you know, Mexican accoutrements, a little sombrero on top of the thing. And it came with a stand, which is very important because you've got to have a stand. You got to put it somewhere. And so I bought the thing for about $50. It sounded like crap. It was like hitting a pot with a wooden spoon. That's what it sounded like. It was lousy. And I would go home and hammer the crap out of it, trying to like loosen it up somehow or make it sound like something. This one actually sounds pretty good. I just will show you. Even softly, it's not terrible. It's not terrible. And actually, when you have a small one like this, you're better off. It isn't so good in the quiet stuff, but it's really pretty good for loud stuff. Listen to the sound of this. You see what I mean? But for quiet, no, that's not bad. It got the job done. Now, the one that I had, I'll put this over here. The one that I had sounded much, much less effective than this one, but you get the picture. You could travel with it, and it made a noise, and that's what mattered. And so I bought the thing, and I ran around to all the community orchestras I could get in touch with because I had friends who were musicians. They were playing, and I said, "You doing something that has a gong? I'll come and play the gong." And any other percussion that needed playing, because usually the way parts are written, it's very, very interesting. The person who plays the gong also plays the triangle because they're very seldom playing at the same time. So you have opportunity to move from one to the next. And then the cymbals and bass drum are other players. So usually you could get away with a 3-person section. That is a cymbal player, a bass drum player, and a triangle/gong player. And that was usually me. And the very first piece I played with Los Banditos, the tam-tam, was Mahler's First Symphony. And I realized right away what the limitations of this thing were, because it was okay in the two loud crashes in the finale, but all that quiet stuff in the funeral march, not so great. Not so great. But I had the gong. And so I got to play Mahler's First. That was the first Mahler symphony I performed in the early 80s at Stanford. And oh my God, it was beyond fun. It was a wonderful program, actually. I remember it vividly, at least the parts that I was in. Because the other thing on the program was the Swan of Twinella. And the Swan of Twinella, believe it or not, has a percussion part. Aside from timpani, it has a very extensive bass drum part, which you almost never hear on recordings. And one of the fascinating things about playing percussion was it was the best education I ever could have had, playing utility percussion, because most of the time you're sitting around doing nothing. You're just listening to what everyone else is doing and watching what everyone else is doing. And you get to know the music inside out, from the back, literally, looking out front. And it was I was enthralled to be able to sit in the orchestra and hear what everyone else is doing. And every so often I'd get up and go splat and a ding, and then I'd sit down. And it was fabulous. I mean, I never had such a good time. It was amazing. And it completely trained me for what to listen for when I review recordings. I mean, people talk about, and some of you have talked about how I'm obsessed with tam-tams and percussion and all that, but that's because I know what's supposed to be heard, and I know what the composer wrote. Did you know, for example, let's stick with Sibelius, that there is a very long bass drum roll in Finlandia? Not where you think it might be, because usually where you hear the bass drum is when the cymbals are going and they're going pow, pow together, right? Usually something like that. That's not how Sibelius uses the bass drum. He uses it for these long, extended pedal points of just sort of like a pressure wave underneath something. And where you hear the bass drum in Finlandia, or should, if the recording ever lets you, is underneath the first appearance of the hymn tune. Da 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 da, ya da da dum ba da dum. The first time that occurs quietly in the woodwinds, there is a bass drum roll underneath that entire passage. It goes on for, a minute and a half, and you almost never hear it. Almost never, but it's there. And so when I started reviewing recordings, I had all of these strange little bits of knowledge, all this trivia, where I knew that percussion parts came in. Mahler is another case in point. His soft gong strokes in the Funeral March of the First Symphony under do 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 do. You've got gong strokes on every half note. It's psh do psh do do psh do psh do do, right? And you almost never hear it. Almost never. And that used to drive me nuts. Another fabulous tam-tam part that I only learned because I actually played it was in Death and Transfiguration. The only extra percussion is a tam-tam, and it's at the moment of death. It goes with the tam-tam. And sometimes you'll hear the first shot because it's marked mezzo forte, even though it's never played mezzo forte, or mezzo piano, or mezzo something. It's never mezzo. It's always too quiet, if it's audible at all. And then it's like Mahler. You get these steady strokes, and they go on for about 4 minutes. And you never hear them. Almost never. There's some performances where you do. So I began to listen hard to hear down through the texture. It was just a fabulous orchestral education. So I played that Mahler first. And it was just incredible fun. The conductor was Eric Kujawski, which was spelled Kujawski, who conducts the Redwood Symphony Orchestra, and he's still doing it. And I also babysat his cat while I was there as well. And it was really just a wonderful experience. But there were some things that went wrong, some things that didn't go too well, some things that were kind of crazy, because community orchestras, you never know what's going to happen. I mentioned one of these stories when I was discussing Respighi's The Pines of Rome, which was the performance I played with the West Valley Symphony Orchestra, a wonderful community group that made recordings of all of its concerts and actually sold them to people, which I thought was kind of remarkable. We were doing the Pines of Rome, and it was one of those orchestras that, community orchestras are always shy of strings. So they were doing the Pines of Rome and something like Strauss's The Happy Workshop, something that was like 50 minutes long for all for the woodwinds. And then for the Pines of Rome, we had the full brass and winds and percussion and the recording of Nightingale number 242 sound effects record. And we had 2 violins and 3 second violins and 1 viola and half a cello and 2/3 of a double bass, but everything else was complete. You probably couldn't hear a note of the strings, and we didn't care because we were going to make such a racket. And I was playing my tam-tam, my trusty tam-tam, and we were bashing and crashing away. And the conductor gives the cutoff, and the piece ends, and the organ, because there's an organ in this piece, didn't stop. He just gave the cutoff, and we all stop, and we hear, and the organist is sitting there looking around like his hands aren't on the keyboard, and this chord is still sounding. And he's like poking at buttons and things, and it wouldn't stop. It was one of those electronic, the keyboard had an electronic attachment. It was a pipe organ. And it was attached to the pipe organ with this enormous cable. It's like this big, this huge cable. And so I was standing next to it. And so I walked over to the organ and just sort of went, I pulled the cable out. And that was the end. And we still got a standing ovation because community orchestra audiences are very, very kindly disposed toward their community orchestra. Usually they're just happy to get out for a free concert, which is basically what it is. And they have a good time. So that was another sort of experience that I had playing percussion. The other one was doing, I mentioned this too, was Holst the Planets with Andor Toth, the redoubtable Hungarian grump who was the conductor of the Stanford Symphony, when I was the only guy who would show up at rehearsals because it was all too easy for the other percussionists. They thought, oh, they'd have to do it. And I played the Glockenspiel solo in Jupiter. Da 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 bum bum da 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 ba-da-da-dum. Oh God, that was fun. But we were bashing and crashing our way through. I think it was what's with Uranus, which was it was Uranus until people started giggling when the Voyager flew by it. It became Uranus. So it's Uranus, and I was whacking the bass drum and hitting the cymbals and smashing the tam-tam, and finally he signals the orchestra to a stop and he says, percussion, piatti. He always referred to the cymbals, and the percussion says piatti, which means cymbals, plates in Italian. Piatti, and I said, yes, and he's looking around, he says, where are the rest of you? And I said, I'm it. I'm the only one here. He said, what do you mean you're the only one here? I said, I'm the only one here. He said, you mean all of that noise was coming from you? I said, yes. He said, that's the most racket I've ever heard a single human being make. I said, I'll take that as a compliment. Thank you. Thank you very much. So, it was a wonderful, wonderful, moving experience. Deeply, deeply mystical, if you want to call it. It was like a Furtwängler performance. It had mysticism in galore in lieu of accuracy, at least when I was playing sometimes. My favorite performance actually was not in California. It was back here in New York when I was doing Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony. I was playing the cymbals. And for some reason, community orchestras like to pretend they're real orchestras, so they wanted us to dress in concert blacks and tuxedos and, tails. And what did I have? I had, I didn't have a rented tux. I actually owned a tux, but it was like kind of old and kind of ratty, and it had an old-fashioned shirt with studs instead of buttons. And I was playing Tchaikovsky's Fourth, and the end of that symphony just really gets rocking with the cymbals. It's crash, 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 ta-ta-tum, ta-ta-tum, ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta- my shirt studs had been popping out through the entire movement. Every time I went like this, something went pew, and they went flying out into the orchestra. I didn't notice. I mean, I maybe saw a couple of the woodwind players doing this, I thought maybe there was a mosquito or something in the room, but it's over and I'm crashing like this and I have my last triumphant pow, and I spread my arms and I looked down and I was completely bare-chested. I mean, I must have been that way for several minutes toward the end of the movement. And I finished the whole thing bare-chested, and I got a fabulous solo ovation. The conductor had me do a solo stand-up. I was mortified, I was trying to keep my shirt closed, but that's what happens with these things. And then another time, I remember very vividly, I was doing Mahler Sixth. Oh dear, Mahler Sixth, and I was the percussion section in Mahler Sixth because I had the cowbells. And I went home to Connecticut, and I hollowed out a large tree stump and grabbed my father's sledgehammer and brought that back. And I had 3 big sets of cowbells in those days. This was before I'd raided the gift shop at Neuschwanstein in Bavaria to get authentic Bavarian cowbells. I had little Indian tinkly cowbells, but they came in these huge racks. I bought them there was a scrap brass store. They sold just all kinds of junk. And I used to spend a lot of time in there because they had all kinds of cool stuff. And they had cowbells and in racks. And so I had 3 racks of cowbells that I got for like $15. They were beyond cheap. And I had the cowbells. I had 2 large tam-tams. I had a stump. I had my sledgehammer. I had my regular stick bag with all the cymbals and triangles and all the other things that Mahler asks for. And mind you, in the Sixth, you don't realize it perhaps, but he asks for them to be doubled. There are moments where you've got to have 2 snare drums. You've got to have at least 3 sets of cymbals. You've got to have multiple triangles. Mahler gives up counting. At the end of the first movement, he just writes mehrere, as many triangles as possible. Everyone who has a free hand has to do triangle rolls at the end of the first movement of Mahler 6. And if you listen to the recordings, you can tell sometimes it's nicely clattery, which is what Mahler wants. So I had to drag all of that stuff all over the city because the rehearsals were never in one place. Each one we actually played the performance at Symphony Space and on Broadway and wherever it is, like 102nd Street or 90-something Street. But we were rehearsing in high school auditoria and in the Bronx on 157th Street in the Bronx. It was everywhere. And fortunately, I had a friend who had a van, and we would throw everything into the van. But I had to load and unload all the stuff at every single rehearsal. You had to be younger than I am now to get away with it. And we were cleaning up after one rehearsal, and I was putting everything back in the van, and I had my 2 tam-tams, which I would wear. I would wear them on my shoulders, and I would carry the stump. And I put the tam-tam down on the ground, and this car came by and ran over it. And that was very, very distressing, but it was a good, sturdy Wuhan tam-tam, and the amusing part of it was that the tam-tam was fine, but the car, the thing just cut right into the tires. It was like putting those speed strips the cops use to stop people in a car chase, to puncture the tires. It was a Volkswagen, I'll never forget. And he runs over the tam-tam. I was horrified. I thought the tam-tam was damaged. I was fine. The car had 3 flat tires and was stuck on the side of the street. And I was like, sorry. What can we do? It happens. Stuff happens all the time. So, those are just some brief tales I wanted to share with you about my life as a performing artist. There are many, many more where that came from. And, I've been sharing these little stories as we talk about the pieces in question, because it's fun to do it and talking about the works. And so you may hear them more than once, and I apologize for that. But I did want to respond to the request that I aggregate some of these. And I have saved what I think is the best for last. This is really a tremendous, tremendous musical event in my life. I was playing with a group called the Crestmore Symphony Orchestra, which played at Kenyatta College. This is back in California on the peninsula. And we were doing Debussy's Nocturnes. Now, and Respighi's Fountains of Rome. And we were doing it in a church. And we had sometimes community orchestras can be a little rebellious. And I was there as usual. I had never missed a rehearsal. I showed up for everything because I was just having such a good time. And I had all the instruments. I had my cymbals, I had my snare drum, I had my triangle, and I had a chime, for the respighi. At the end of the respighi, it goes bong, bong. And you can buy, you may not know this, but tubular bell chimes, you can buy them separately. You can buy them individually. So I had my individual, whatever it was, a B flat, I don't know, whatever the note is, I had it. And there was a big fight amongst the percussion section, between the percussion section and the conductors. I mean, I was never a lead percussionist. I was always the guy who did whatever anyone else didn't want to do. And they quit. And they quit just before the actual performance. It was after the dress rehearsal. Before the actual performance. And the conductor was in a panic. And he called me up and he said, listen, I'm really screwed here. Is there anything you can do? I said, I don't know. I'm not in the music school. I'm not like a pro here. I just will do what I can myself. He said, okay, don't worry. If you can't find anyone, you can just do whatever you want to do back there. Just make noise at the appropriate time. And so I thought about it. And I had a very, very good friend who is still a very, very dear friend. His name was Javier Rodriguez. Hello, Javier, my best to the gang. And he was just one of those really intellectually curious guys. He was interested in everything. And I called him up and I said, how would you like to go to a concert? And he said, sure, I'd love to. I said, it's free. It's absolutely free. He said, really? Is it free? Yeah. And he had a friend. I said, I forget his name. Just there's one condition. The two of you have to wear suits. You got to wear suits and ties. He said, okay, fine. So I get him and his friend in a suit and a tie, and we get in my car, and we drive up to Cañada College on the day of the concert, and we walk onto the stage, and I said, okay, I'm playing snare drum, you're playing cymbals, you're playing triangle. And they looked at me in horror, and they said, what are you talking about? I said, yes, we are the orchestra. We are the percussion section of the Crestmore Symphony Orchestra. And I said to the conductor, don't worry, they know what they're doing. And they had no clue. And I said to them, when I shout, when I point, you take those cymbals and you just whack the crap out of them, just like this. And they did. They did. It was really fascinating. Did we get all of it? No. Did we get 50% of it? No. But we probably got about 40% of it. Fête was maybe a little bit more raucous than Debussy had originally intended. And the huge, fountain with the Triton and the what's his name? The fish god guy, whizzing along, and Poseidon, that's him with whipping along. Well, that had, I think, a couple extra climaxes thanks to us, but we got through it. It was great. And when it was over, this was a Catholic church, and it was, of course, it was a Catholic church. It was run by or managed by an order of nuns, and they were all there, and they're so nice. They came up to me specifically afterwards because they saw me running around back there and yelling at everyone and doing. They said, that was just marvelous. It was absolutely beautiful. And I said, yes, thank you very much, sister. I really appreciate it. You have no idea how much I appreciate it. But we had just a whale of a good time. And it's the kind of stuff that you got away with when you were playing in community orchestras. All kinds of crazy stuff happened. And there's a lot more where that came from, but I think that's more than enough for now. So I appreciate you joining me as I just blab along with this stuff. But these are very, very happy memories. And more importantly, it was just the best way to learn the music. You cannot take the place of actual performance experience of that kind. A violinist isn't going to get it. A violinist is going to have to play. They have to sit there and read all those notes and play them, or the woodwind players and the brass players. They have to really care what happens. But all I had to do was sit in the back, and when they pointed at me, go, pow! And I was pretty good at doing that. So it was what made me the critic I am today, for good or for ill. Don't get snarky, but do keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.